Hi, I'm Esin, and I review stuff. Welcome to a segment that I call Movie Friday, where I talk about movies that you might want to check out or avoid for your Friday evening, Saturday evening, or just your weekend viewing experience in general. This week I'm going to be talking about the movie The Legend of Hell House, the 1973 adaptation of the 1971 book by Richard Matheson, Hell House, that has nothing whatsoever to do with that fucking found footage movie. The Legend of Hell House is a very loose adaptation of the original source material, and although the screenplay has apparently been written by Richard Matheson, it does kind of stand as a testament that even back then, the book was better than the movie. Directed by John Hugh, or I think that's how his name is pronounced, whom you may know from movies like The Howling 4 or American Gothic, or more recently Bad Karma, The Legend of Hell House is as much a haunted house tale as the book itself was. For those of you who have not watched my review of the book, which I'm not above shameless self-promotion, so please do, but The Legend of Hell House concerns four individuals who go into the most haunted house in America to determine whether or not life exists after death for the sake of money offered to them by a dying millionaire. Joining us in our crusade is Clive Revill as Dr. Barrett, Gail Honeycutt as his wife Anne Barrett, Pamela Franklin as the spiritual medium Florence Tanner, and Roddy McDowall as the shell-shocked Hell House veteran Benjamin Franklin Fisher. They go in with every intention of actually finding out whether or not life manages to survive after death, and they're about to find far more than they bargained. Well, first things first, this is a book adaptation, and Richard Matheson, when writing the screenplay, seems to have opted to adapt out a lot of the key components of the story. This has had some good results and some bad results. Let me just start with the bad so we can finish on a high note. First of all, the plot structure is completely different. Even though the same events do take place, a lot of the interim moments that carried weight on the main events themselves are completely absent. As a result of this, whatever's happening on screen can often feel like it's just coming out of nowhere. Case in point, there was a scene in the book while under the influence of the house, Edith Barrett, Dr. Barrett's wife, tried to seduce Fisher, even going so far as to flash him her tits. This does also happen in the movie, but since Anne Barrett's character is not established or established quite as much as the more or less quintessential dutiful wife stereotype, this behavior doesn't really come out of nowhere. The movie manages to turn this into a positive by having Anne Barrett act fucking insane. And to her credit, Gail Honeycutt does an incredible job in portraying a woman that is just violently in lust and after violent delights. It is a joy to watch, but the fact that this is uncharacteristic behavior is very difficult to infer from the scene alone. Like, if you hadn't read the book, you would know. The second and more important way in which these omissions affect the story is that they alter the central mystery quite a bit, to the point where the revelation in the end, performed by Benjamin Franklin Fisher, seems to be closer to bat deduction than any rational thought process. Seriously, instead of arriving at the point that he does through careful consideration of the facts, he just seems to be pulling things out of the air and out of his ass and just connecting them, and they somehow end up being true. This is not a very good way of storytelling, and given that the author has chosen to preserve the central mysteries of the book, their resolution being haphazard just makes it look bad. I really can't define it in any other way. It's just fucking bad. A change that I was actually extremely disappointed by, however, was the fact that Barrett, as the arguable lead of the film, is a dashing gentleman as opposed to the man who has almost lost a leg to polio and needs considerable help moving around. Now, I wouldn't exactly mind this, but the fact that Barrett has limited mobility has an impact on how the events unfold, in that he's unable to interfere and or unable to get away from certain dangers because of this disability. I mean, of course, in order to balance this change in character's capabilities, Matheson has also adapted out any instances where his limited mobility was a problem, so I guess it evens out in the end. The fact that some of the events have been adapted out also means that the plot moves at a very fast pace. The script has a pretty good idea as to which events it wants to include and how to connect them all. And as a result of this, the plot is constantly on the move and there is no time to rest, even if fast paced didn't quite mean then what it means now. In writing the screenplay, Matheson also toned down the sex and violence quite a bit, mainly because he wanted the movie to have a more ominous atmospheric feel as opposed to the viciousness that the book often displayed. The cinematography actually reflects this quite well. The movie uses lopsided Dutch angles quite a lot, especially when observing characters. It contributes to the overall feel of the film in that it sort of disorients you in the way that it chooses to observe its characters. One of the best examples of this is a scene where Fisher sits down and tries to tap into his medium skills in order to receive what Hell House is willing to dish out to him. It is in that scene that you also see another strength of the movie, which is the performances, which can be hammy as fuck or very nicely nuanced. For me, the two performances that stick out are Roddy McDowall's portrayal of Benjamin Franklin Fisher and Pamela Franklin's portrayal of Florence Tanner. For his part, McDowall chooses to portray the extremely pissed off, cantankerous, difficult to get along with Fisher as more of a subdued, post-traumatic stress suffering, basically shell-shocked veteran type fashion. Whereas the book version of Fisher is always snide and constantly snapping at the other characters for being naive and foolish, this Fisher chooses to be more reserved, and when he speaks, it is almost as if he is afraid to do so. He's almost always soft-spoken, and his character seems to take on the role of the one character in horror movies who constantly spouts out ominous portents of doom. Like, seriously, most of the time, as opposed to just serving as warnings to other characters, he seems to be just saying shit like we're all going to die in here for no other reason than to have said it. As a result of this, while I appreciate this interesting and more layered take on the character, it does get kind of funny. Pamela Franklin's performance as Florence Tanner also seems to manage to strike a very delicate and near perfect balance between the character's more naive and more headstrong aspects. On one hand, she is way too young to be the Florence Tanner that at least I pictured when I read the book, but she plays it off as being somewhat inexperienced and, perhaps because of her faith, at least that's how it's presented, a bit naive. But on the other hand, when she believes in something, when she commits to a path, she is stubborn as a fucking mule. As a result of this balance and the wonderful performance that she gives is this straight-backed, head-held high medium who actually has conviction in what she's doing, her constant clashes with Dr. Barrett are far more bearable. Of course, there's the fact that they're less numerous here than they were in the book, but when they happen, you can clearly see two people both convinced that they know what is going on, going at it, trying to convince or, more accurately, override the other one and pull them towards their own path. The more passive or pensive Fisher and the more passive, decidedly, Anne, who seems to have been relegated to the duty of requesting exposition in this movie. Fucking seriously, every 2 seconds Anne Barrett seems to have a question to ask, whether it's about the history of Hell House, what that device is, what they're doing, what their working theory is, what they're gonna do next. And while this is a rather expeditious method of delivering exposition to the audience, it is way too blatant, and having main characters get tied down with having to answer her constant barrage of questions, usually coming from her husband, it just gets tiresome and fucking transparent after a while. The movie does manage to establish a very ominous, very foreboding atmosphere despite its numerous flaws, and it manages to create a rather enjoyable, if somewhat cliched, haunted house experience. I mean, if you are in this to be scared out of your wits by a movie that was made in the 70s, I'm sorry, but you're shit out of luck. But if you are in this to see how horror used to be portrayed and how dank old houses in which various acts of degradation have taken place to the degree that it is left it haunted, this is your movie. On that note, I would say that the visual and or practical effects that are in this movie are very fair for their time, to the point where some of them even manage to hold up today. Of course, this sort of depends on whether you prefer practical effects over CGI, which I usually do, so I was pleasantly surprised to find out that the visual effects were so good in this one. So would I recommend this? Well, for an almost 50-year-old movie, The Legend of Hell House is a surprisingly nice experience. It is not the best old horror movie that you're going to see, but it is certainly not going to be the worst one. It is worth watching based on the performances alone. So why not take the time this weekend to take a trip to the past and see how horror used to be before it was all CGI monsters and jump scares. And if you have seen this one already, why don't you let me know what you think in the comments below. If you like my content, please like, comment, and subscribe, as it helps a lot. But all that aside, for now, I hope you have a great weekend. It's Eason. Doubt.